Okay, so class one is about preparing to mix. The first thing that I talk about here is what is mixing, right? What is mixing? And essentially, mixing has been going on since the beginning of recording. And the difference is that the way things were mixed were by moving the musicians in and around the recording space. And if you had a microphone, if you look at some old vintage recordings or pictures, you'll see these big things. They're like they're microphones that are like big tubes, right? And the tubes get wider towards the mouth, and so the sound is meant to funnel in. So and they have these old carbon mics that they use, which are horrible. They sounding, right? They not a lot of good frequency response on them, like nothing above 2K or anything like that. But basically, it was sort of like, hey, we can do this, right? It's kind of like the first microphone isn't going to be this brilliant, incredible sounding microphone. Most of the time, the first of anything is this kind of crappy thing, the clunky that just barely works. And then you figure out how to refine it, So the first airplane, they show the Wright brothers, sitting there with wings and trying to flap, and they, like doing all these crazy things. And it's like, okay, it sort of works. They get off the ground for 100 feet, and then they land back down, and the whole thing fumbles over or tumbles over and falls apart, right? And so that's kind of the whole thing. Everything kind of grows in steps. So in the early days of recording, it was all about getting the musicians, the performers in a room, and kind of moving them around in the space at different distances from the microphone that was capturing them. And that was really the blend. There are still people that do that today, right? If you've ever gotten into Chesky Records, or if you look up Chesky Records, Chesky, I believe, records, and you go to their website, they do all their recordings live to 2-track, everything. So they set up a microphone in a room. The guy has everything hardwired into his mic pre-console recording device, and they just record. And what they do is they get a really great sounding room. They move everybody around the space, and get their instruments set up in the right way, the tone of the instruments, the balance of the instruments, everybody the right distance, the right volume. And then they capture performances, right? They do treatments in the room, to control the reverb time and everything. And the recordings are ridiculous. I mean, they are so good sounding, like you can't believe. And it's all done. And that's like, a captured recording mixed. And the mixing is by literally moving people around. I always thought, and someone will do it, right? They'll create an application where you plug in the individual instruments, and instead of having, an EQ and compressor and all these individual controls, you'll just have a stage, and you select the room that you want the music to be in, and then you select an icon for each instrument, and you just look at a graphic, like a 3D graphic animation, and you just move those different instruments around different places in the space, and then it shows up with the correct amount of reverb, compression, equalization, etc. And then you can, blow up the size of it, shrink it down, do all these things. And that's kind of what it is, right? And so someday that will be mixing. And then, people like me will be like, oh, it's the destruction of mixing and all that sort of stuff. But that's a basic, that idea, it's not far away, right? I'm sure there's somebody working on it right now. And this fits in perfectly because getting to a visual approach to audio, and I'm going to switch off and show you some graphics there. But as technology increased, and you got to a place where now you had multiple microphones, you had isolation booths, the engineers had multiple mic pre's in the room, then they were able to mix from the control room, right, by controlling the individual mic pre's or levels of people. And the only issue that you had there is that you actually had to do the mix down as the performers were going, right? And so it's very difficult to anticipate when somebody is going to lay into a note harder than what you expected, right? So it's very difficult. And I always have this utmost admiration for mix engineers who do live sound, because you have to react to what people are doing live, and if you're working on a tour with a band, you rehearse all these things and you work out all the cues and you know what everybody's going to do, but you always still have to be like laser focused on what everybody is doing and kind of anticipating problems and being able to correct them quickly, right? So it's not an easy thing, right? It's not an easy thing, right? And so there is this process, and then it got to multi-track recording. And when you got to multi-track recording, now the mix engineer could breathe a sigh of relief and go back to their console and then work with the individual sounds and process them independently. And then as multi-track recording expanded, then the need for automation came in. So now you had fader automation, where the faders would either be done with VCAs, automation, right? So the actual movement of the levels is actually happening underneath the fader, which is stationary, or you would have actual motorized faders that would be moving. And so that started up that, and they kept growing with that. And then you had digital consoles, which would allow you to sweep frequencies on EQs and automate all the settings on a big console, right? And then this went into the DAW world, when now it's all graphic, and you could literally like draw what it is that you wanted to do. All right, so that's the evolution of mixing as it's gone. So it's incredible what you have the ability to do now, but mixing has been going on from the very beginning, right? Then you just had to do it from a more practical matter about where you place the musicians in the space. And now, once you've captured the individual recordings, you can control almost any aspect and automate it exactly the way that you want it to be, right? So it's incredible. So the next is the visual approach to audio. And in working with there's a connection, right? An indistinguishable or an inextricable connection between what we see and what we hear, right? So this is something that is built into our DNA, right? When we listen to sound and we listen to we look out in our world, we hear things, and they're almost always associated with physical objects, right? So when you're playing sound through your speakers, you can look at your speakers, right? You can see where the sound is coming from. You pan it to the left, and it moves over to the left speaker. Brilliant. Your phone rings, right? Where is the phone? Oh, I listen, and my binaural cues tell me that it's behind me on the floor, right? And you know that. You turn around and you go pick it up, right? Whatever it is, right? Someone knocks on the door, right? You know exactly where the door is, right? There's a car beeping right on the road. Somebody beeps their horn. You know exactly where it is, right? You turn around. These binaural cues are built in, and they don't disappear when you play sound through speakers. They're colored a little bit because the sound is coming from two locations, right? From two speakers, or three, right? If you have a sub. But the imaging cues still work there. Part of the art of mixing is actually exaggerating those binaural cues, or understanding and breaking down what it is that makes a sound up close to us, as opposed to making it far away from us. And in the process of doing this, what I've broken down is the effect of different things, right, on the 3D sound field. In other words, the louder something is, right, if I just look from a top view, for example, here in our mixing scheme, when something is louder, it comes up closer to us, right? It's pretty simple, right? So if I just have, maybe I'll just kind of create an object here, right? So this is our sound, right? And then I can take the sound, and it's like, once I have the sound, if it's louder, it comes up closer to us. If it's lower in level, it goes back. Right? That's one aspect of what moves something forward. Okay, but when something moves back, it also has to be smaller, right? So if we look at what this actual sound does here, right, it will actually sound smaller the farther away it gets from us. So if you think about it like, those horizon pictures, where you look down a road and it looks like the sides of the road kind of meet together at the horizon. Okay, and it's that kind of thing. So as the sound comes toward us, it actually gets bigger, and that size is reflected in frequency response. It's reflected in the volume, right? It's in the attention to detail. So the farther something away, the farther somebody is away from you, if they're talking to you, the harder it is to distinguish what it is they're saying. Whereas if they're right in front of you, 2 feet in front of you, and they're talking to you, it's very clear and easy to understand what they're saying. So what happens is distant things lose low frequency response, which gets absorbed in the ground and transmits there, and high frequency response, which loses energy because the waveforms are very small, right? The fluctuations in air pressure are very small. And so what we get is a more mid-range kind of a thing. And we get less dynamic. So what happens is the attack is not as prominent, right? And therefore, if you want something to sound distant, you need a fast attack on the compression, right? You need to filter the frequency response. You need to lower the level. So it needs to be smaller, less transient, less defined in terms of the actual sound of the instrument, so it's a little bit fuzzier, and it needs to and then we'll get into reverb and all of that sort of stuff, and that's part of what it takes to make it sound more distant. When we have something up close, it needs to be more full frequency. It needs to be clearer. The transient needs to be very apparent. You need to be able to hear all that low-level information, right? If it's a person's voice, you hear like all the spit in their voice, right? The snot in their nose, you hear everything, right? It's just right there. It's very apparent, right? All the detail, whether you like it or not, right, is right there. So, and this is part of this front-back movement. Part of working with stereo is also a thing, because in moving things backward, to make things sound more distant, they need to be monoed up, right, as the farther away that they get, sort of like the horizon with the sides of the road, right? So if you're standing on the road and you imagine that, you know, if I were to just kind of draw something here, right, and you kind of had the road going off from your speakers off into the distance, and I didn't leave enough space here, so way off in the distance here, like imagine you're looking down a road this way. What happens is that if you, say, have an instrument and you spread it hard, wide, left, and right, it's going to sound up closer to you. Whereas if you take that stereo instrument and then you make it, kind of like this, it'll sound that far away. And the more mono you make it, the more distant it will sound. Now, you can move that over here, right? So in other words, it doesn't have to be this way. The road could be skewed this way, and that's fine. Right? But that same size component needs to kind of be there, right? It has to get more mono, like the farther away it gets you, smaller in frequency, less transient, etc. And so this is a great way to move things up in front and back, right? And really understanding the different parameters that go into that, right? Very cool. So that's an important concept. Obviously, the simplest thing is the panning, right, which is just a left-right thing. And the left-right helps to work relative with the volume, right, which moves things front and back. And then the compression and equalization help to, kind of exaggerate that effect. When you get into effects processing, right, and you get into reverbs, one of the things about a sound that's distant is that the reverb arrives at you almost at the same time as the direct sound, right? So if the walls are over here and the sound bounces off the walls and hits you at a certain time later, that delay time is much shorter than if the person is right in front of you. So if the sound source is right in front of you, then the sound has to bounce back off of all the surfaces around to hit you, and therefore it is what's called pre-delay. How long does it take before the onset of reverb? And this is how you create space and effect. A great trick to creating size, because when you add the pre-delay, what you do is you can make something sound very present, and this is like a classic 101 engineering thing, and that is that if you want the vocal to sound up front, but you want it to be like very have a good amount of reverb, like an R&B ballad, then you get that vocal sounding really up front and focused. Then you have the pre-delay, so the reverb kind of sounds like it goes off into the distance, but you have the dry vocal up front, and they're somehow connected. Another great way to do that is to do like an echo or a slap, right? So if you have a slapback, it's kind of like, think of like being like in an alleyway, and there's a building like 100 feet away from you. So you have, when you're talking, you hear this delay that bounces back 200 milliseconds later, and it gives you a sense of depth, right? It's like, even with your eyes closed, how far away that building is, right? You get a sense of where objects are and things are. And so when you have that delay, that the amount of time it takes for it to hit that wall, whatever it is back here, and get back, the sound is going to be filtered, right? Because it's traveling, so there'll be less high frequency response, less low frequency response, smaller, more monoed up, and then it bounces back, and you get this sense like, hey, there's this thing, the vocal is not just here, there's actually something far away, right, that it's bouncing off of. And actually, what's interesting is that bouncing off of that effect helps the vocal sound more up front, right, which is really incredible. Or putting a static chorusing effect, right, where you sort of pitch shift and with a slight delay the vocal and feed it hard left and right. And what this does is it actually moves the sound with that slight phase shift outside of the speakers and then kind of pulls the sound of the vocal out toward you more. These are common tricks that just with the very simple basic tools that you have, without a lot of complicated, you don't need like extraordinary plugins to do all of this. These are basic plugin features that you can use that you can open up and pull things forward or back, right, in a mix. And that's one big part of the 3D sound field. So when we get into working with up-down, right, because we have up-down, front, and back, one of the things that I talk about a lot is that the different frequency areas will show up in different areas, and there's a reason for this, right? Low frequencies, when we get to low frequencies will have this tendency to sink down low on the floor. And the reason that they do so is that most low frequency energy we actually feel more than we hear. And so that low frequency energy vibrates the floor, right? And therefore it kind of sits there. Low mid energy kind of sits in this in-between area, right? So these low mids, and it also sits a little bit back in the speakers, right? So this low mid energy is like this warmth, and the waveforms are big enough that they're able to go around furniture and objects and things like that. So you hear them there. Mid-range frequencies will put things right in a box between the speakers. If you have too much low mid, it'll suck up the low frequencies and pull them up in between the speakers. That happens a lot, right? So the balance of low mid to lows is important to keeping the low frequencies down, right? You want the low frequencies dense, powerful, and a bit if that's what you're trying to do. The thicker you make the low mid-range, the more the low frequencies kind of pull up with them to the middle of the speakers. Right, so you got mid-range frequencies, and this adds like definition. This is such an important area of the mix because these mid-range frequencies, and we're talking like, probably, let's just say like 500 up to about 2K, right? This frequency range is represented in almost every listening device that you will ever have. Your laptop speakers, your earbuds, everything. You will get something represented. And everything, every element of every mix has to have some part of its signal represented in this range in order for your mix to translate to the smaller devices, right? High mid frequencies pull things towards us, right? So when we get to the high mid range, 2 to 6K range, right, those frequencies will pull it out of the speaker toward us. This is all the articulation, right? This is what allows us to, when we listen to different words, right? The difference between ghost and most and host and whatever, toast, right? So you could hear those different words, but it's actually that high mid-range that allows you to distinguish the T from the G, from the M, from the, L, whatever, right? All the different letters. High frequencies, the very high frequencies raise things up in the speakers because the only place where high frequencies really travel efficiently is up above us. They bounce off the ceiling, but when they hit soft objects, when they hit furniture, they lose all their energy real quick. So we get this sensation of height, right, and with the high frequencies, because that's the area where they're least affected, right, where they kind of travel most efficiently and most freely. And so when you have like a good amount of density, you can actually move the sound up and down, front and back in the speakers by employing all of these different elements, right, in everything. If you look here, those mid-range frequencies, when you start to filter off high and high mids, low and low mids, that's what makes the sound small and more distant, right? And that's how you can get that distance happening there, right? And then if you move that low cut up to a higher mid, then it will sound, less distant, but still far away, but with a higher frequency. And you can start to play with all these different ways that you work with delays and effects and creating depth and perception, right? And all of this is having a basic understanding of acoustics of things that we already know, right? And that is really like the big, element of, what I wanted to get to here. Speaker placement. Now, when we get into the placement of speakers, this gets to be, a thing where I guess probably the best way to show this here is if you have a mixing position and maybe just kind of go from a top view, there will be some kind of a triangulated position. And maybe this desk is not in the right place. You should be like right about here where this arrow is. And so if we're looking at it from this perspective, and I just kind of put a head right here, you should be kind of triangulated, right? So you're the same distance from sort of equilaterally triangulated. You don't want your speakers too close to the wall, right? You want to try to divide the room if you can, so that if you cut a line down the middle, right, it's the same on both sides. And that's not always possible, right? So you work the best way that you can within the space that you have. But you want speakers that are appropriately sized for the room, right? You want to make sure that the speakers are at the right height, right? So that when you actually set up the tweeters, right, and you actually look at them, and I actually have a mixing with Mike video that's just exactly about this, right? Let's just see if I can hide that for a second. And scale up here. I had like a whole series of, there we go. See, like one of the things, like one of the most common mistakes that people make with like NS10s, like the tweeters, if you need to lay speakers on their side, would be the high frequencies outward. And if they're not outward, they're up high or spread wide, because the high frequencies are the most directional. That's where you determine the angle of the speakers, right? How they're angled towards you, right? The height has to be correct, right? So if you put them, ideally you want speakers on stands, right? The size of the speakers should be based off of the size of your room. The smaller the room, the smaller the speakers you get with a sub, right? The great part about speaker stands is it creates some isolation or some decoupling from the floor, right? And that helps to make them sound more efficient and resonate the room less. And if you can't do that, then you want speaker mounts. You want to be able to put your speakers on something that helps to isolate them so that you're not resonating the desk that they're sitting on or something like that, right? So at very least, you can get some foam, right? And you can put them on some neoprene or something like that. The other thing is having the speakers at the right height, right? So that they're at the same height as your head, right? You want to be able to make sure that when you're sitting in front of the speakers comfortably, you're not having to, bend your back weirdly or crouch your head forward or backward or up or down in order to get them positioned correctly. You want to sit comfortably and have the height of the speakers be such that the tweeter is right in line or pretty much right in line with your ear, okay? Because that is, is going to be the most important thing. So are there decent 4-inch speakers? Worth getting a 5 seems to be the minimum. Yeah, I think you can go, I would try to be at least with a 5-inch speaker if you can, and then go with a sub to go along with that. You have to kind of just work within the room. I mean, obviously, I think, when you get to like a 5-inch speaker, that's probably about as small as you should go. You should be able to work with that in almost any listening environment, because now when you start getting below there, then you're starting to look at like computer speakers almost. And so, like 5-6-inch should kind of be more or less at the low end, and that will allow the sub, because you want something that ideally it should be at least at the low end be able to cover down to like 85 cycles or 70 cycles. On its own, and then you could let the sub pick up the rest. Because if you go up with a smaller speaker and you put in a sub, then you get this hole in the low frequencies, right? Like around 80 or 100 cycles, and that's no good, right? That's a real problem because it's a very important area in the mix. So the lower in frequency you go, the more monoed it becomes. So the sub becomes less of an issue and the separation of stereo becomes less apparent as you start to go down below 85 hertz. So, when you get your speakers, you want them to be able to reproduce down that low efficiently. If they can go down to like 70 cycles efficiently, that's really, really great. And you can pick up the rest with your sub. And then the bigger the space, then the bigger you can go with the main monitors, which is always great. It's nicer to still, there is some stereo spread with low frequencies, but that's kind of, that's is what it is. You have to kind of work with that, and I'll get into a lot of detail about that. So speaker placement using monitors, right? So how you actually tune the monitors. Very important that you have to listen to a lot of music when you place speakers in the room. You have to really listen to a lot of music that commercially released music, not your own music. Or unless your music is commercially released, then you're really comfortable with it. Maybe you worked it in studios and it's like it sounds great everywhere. Get your system at home to sound that way too, right? Get them tune in that way, because when you listen to commercially released music, if everything is always too much low end or too much this or not enough that, you can at least work the speakers so that they're sounding good. I think it's actually less important to you never want to hype your speakers. That's one thing that you can make a mistake on, but you want them to sound good when you listen to music, right? And that's more important than having flat frequency response. Way more important. I listen for imaging quality more than I listen for frequency response, because frequencies are very static things that are easily fixed, right, if they're out of balance in a mix. But the imaging is something that is much harder to fix when you get to mastering. So if you have a little bit too much low end, but basically your mix images really, really well, the mastering engineer will tweak that, and that will actually just enhance all the great work that you've done. So all that I'm focusing on is how do you create the density and focus of the individual instruments so that you can kind of place them where you want. And if there's an imbalance at certain frequency areas, those adjustments aren't going to collapse all the great work that you've done. Whereas when you build a mix based on frequency response, it generally ends up being very flat, kind of lifeless, lacks depth. And when the frequency is out of balance, the mastering engineer, when they go and they touch and move anything, the whole thing falls apart like a house of cards. And that's really important. Using headphones is difficult, right? From that perspective, one of the things that I recommend if you're going to use headphones is there's loads of speaker pictures here. Maybe I got it up here. Can't remember where. Yeah, it's right up here. When you're using headphones, you want to make sure your headphones have open back, right? So that they're vented on the back side, right? So that they're balanced. These are not good for recording because the sound bleeds out the backside as well as going in, but it balances off the low-mid frequencies, right? So you don't get that low-end buildup and low-mid buildup inside the cabinet of the, cabinet, whatever you want to call it, inside the body of the actual headphone itself. And that's really important, right? That helps to balance out the frequency response better. And it's worth investing maybe in a Redline monitor, right? And this is a plugin that simulates speakers, right? So it doesn't simulate speakers like different types of speakers and their tonal characteristic, but what it does is it allows you to, it'll feed a little bit of the left signal into the right ear delayed and the right signal into the left ear delayed, so that you get the sensation that the sound is more in front of you as opposed to just inside your head, which is the effect. And it works really, really well. And you have to listen to just a ton of music with it. To really, to get used to it. And then you have to spend some time to kind of balance it with the speakers so that when you get it set up right, when you take your headphones off, it's going to sound different with frequencies and all that, and it's obviously going to be in an acoustic space, but basically you don't want the levels to change, like your center image strength, right? Which is really the most important thing, should sound the same in the headphones as it does in the speakers, right? Getting those balances. And if you're triangulated, then that kind of works perfectly, right? So that's really like a great, a great thing there. So we'll talk a bit about that, right? Using monitors, using headphones, and how all that kind of plays in.